Sometimes a promise spoken as a joke can bind two lives tighter than any oath. She laughed and said she would belong to the man who found her lost ring. She never expected the quiet cowboy to take her at her word. The day was already slipping away when Adam Mercer rode across the open flats bordering Red Valley, the sun lowering behind the jagged ridge as amber light stretched long and low across the land, smoothing the edges of fence, posts and scrub brush, until everything looked softer than it truly was. His horse moved with the tired, steady gait of an animal that knew the trail by heart, hooves stirring pale dust that lingered in the air behind them like smoke. Adam had spent the afternoon at the trading post collecting wire, lamp oil, and a new rasp for the horse's hooves, the kind of practical errands that filled his days and kept his thoughts occupied. He traveled alone more often than not, preferring to be home before dark so he could shut the chickens in, check the gates, and lock the barn before night settled in. Routine kept him grounded. Predictability replaced the trust he no longer placed in people. Years earlier, and he had lost his brother and whatever standing he once had in a nearby town. After a violent dispute he never fully explained to anyone, and since then he had chosen isolation, on a dry stretch of land where no one expected conversation or explanations. His purpose had narrowed into something simple and survivable: keep the ranch from falling apart and avoid trouble that didn't belong to him. As he neared the yard, he noticed movement near the water trough. A shape bent low to the ground. A woman knelt in the dirt with her palms pressed flat, sifting through the packed soil with tense, careful movements. Her long black hair loose and dust clung at the ends. The dress she wore bore beadwork and fringe, suited for travel rather than ceremony. Worn but not careless. She didn't look injured, yet her posture spoke of exhaustion, the kind earned by days of walking while never allowing one's guard to drop. Adam brought his horse to a halt a short distance away and watched in silence. Weighing what he saw, desperate people came to ranches for many reasons, some seeking food, others shelter, a few bringing nothing but trouble. But this woman didn't fit any pattern he recognized. She wasn't begging or hiding. She was focused, intent, so absorbed that she might not have noticed him at all. When she finally lifted her head and met his gaze, her eyes were steady and guarded. She didn't jump up or reach for a weapon. She simply breathed in a measured rhythm, the kind learned by someone who had practiced, concealing fear even when it burned beneath the ribs. She told him she'd lost a ring and added, with a strained attempt at humor, that any man who found it could claim her as his wife. The joke landed awkwardly, more shield than invitation. Adam didn't smile, but it didn't unsettle him either. He recognized the tone of someone pretending their situation wasn't as dire as it felt. Without answering, he loosened the reins, dismounted, and walked toward her, boots pressing into the dirt as he crouched beside her without crowding her space. Her eyes tracked his hands, waiting to see his intent. He didn't touch her or question her. He placed his fingers against the ground and began moving dirt aside with slow, deliberate care. He helped her not because he expected anything in return, but because her voice carried a tightness he recognized from years of holding his own losses in check. She watched him as closely as he watched the ground. Her thoughts raced behind a controlled expression, wondering if he expected payment, if he saw opportunity, or if he was deciding whether she was worth the trouble. She had left a hostile camp 2 days earlier after tensions turned dangerous, carrying only enough food for one more night and no clear knowledge of which lands or people might offer safety. The ring she searched for had belonged to her mother, the last tangible link to a life already stripped away, and losing it in the dust felt like severing the final thread to anyone she had once trusted. Adam worked quietly, brushing aside clumps of soil and gravel, listening not only to the ground but to her breathing and the subtle shifts of her weight, aware of the fear she tried not to reveal. After several minutes, his fingertips struck something cool beneath the surface. He pinched it free and lifted a thin silver band into the fading light. When she saw it, her body went rigid, breath catching as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. Adam didn't rush to hand it over. He held it out on his open palm at a distance that required no step closer. She reached slowly, her hand trembling once before she closed her fingers around it and lowered her gaze, as if needing to confirm it was real. Adam stood in an unhurried motion and gestured toward the trough, offering water without words. She hesitated, not from lack of thirst, but from long habit of expecting conditions attached to every kindness. When he stepped back, giving her space, the tension eased and she cupped water in her hands, drinking in careful sips that soothed her raw throat. He gathered a few pieces of wood and built a modest fire near the center of the yard, striking flint against kindling without ceremony. He didn't invite her to sit or ask for thanks. He had no intention of sending anyone into the night without cause. She weighed her choices in silence, legs trembling with fatigue as she shifted her stance. Night air grew colder quickly, and sleeping without fire meant waking stiff and weak. Yet staying near a stranger carried its own risk. She studied his posture as he sat near the flames, shoulders slightly hunched, ready for confrontation but not seeking it, and his stillness felt safer than forced hospitality ever could. She moved closer to the fire and lowered herself near its edge, warmth slowly loosening the tightness in her back as her fingers brushed the ring again to reassure herself it was still there. Adam set a strip of dried meat nearby without comment, watching the flames rather than her. For the first time in days, her breathing slowed. Coyotes cried somewhere beyond the property line as the sky deepened to blue, and Adam added another log while she shifted a little closer. Not enough to signal trust, but enough to show she wasn't preparing to flee. They didn't speak again, sharing a silence that felt neither strained nor empty, both aware of how rare it was to sit near a stranger and feel less threatened than being alone. By the time night settled fully over the flats, a quiet truth had already formed between them, unspoken but undeniable, that this moment was neither accident nor convenience, but the beginning of something neither had expected. Morning arrived softly, grey light slipping through cracks in the cabin boards as Adam stepped outside to check the yard by habit, scanning fences, the henhouse, and the trough. Everything stood as it should. She sat near the remains of the fire, legs folded beneath her, back straight, despite a night of near wakefulness, eyes red from vigilance rather than mistrust of him. Adam nudged the ashes with a branch and returned with bread and beans on tin plates. Setting one beside her without ceremony, hunger won out over caution. As she ate, he noted the bruises on her arm, the scuffs on her knees, the dirt ground into her seams. Signs of long travel she did not mention. When he asked her name, she paused, weighing the risk of offering it, then spoke clearly. "Naeli." He nodded and gave his own only after she met his eyes. Adam Mercer. No handshake followed, just a simple exchange of truths. Afterward, he walked to the barn, and she followed at a distance, observing his steady movements and the smell of dry hay and old wood inside. She touched a repaired saddle strap, noting the precise stitching, and when he noticed, he handed her a cloth to wipe dust away, practical and unpatronizing. While they worked, she kept her story to herself, the memory of leaving the camp heavy but unshared. And outside, the wind stirred loose dirt across the yard. He brushed the horse's hooves while she stepped back instinctively, knowing when not to crowd an animal. When he asked where she was headed, she answered honestly that she didn't know, only that she needed to be away from where she had been, and he accepted it without pressing. They walked the boundary fence together, the land stretching wide and dry, and when they found a broken post, she noted the fresh crack from last night's wind and held it steady while he tightened the wire, their cooperation unspoken and natural. Back at the yard, she waited for him to tell her to leave, unsettled by his lack of demands, until she finally asked if he wanted her gone. He answered simply that he didn't unless she planned to harm him or his stock, and she sat on the porch step, listening to a hawk overhead as the morning settled into quiet. For the first time since leaving the camp, she breathed without pain, not fully safe, but closer to it than she had been in longer than she could remember. The afternoon stretched into a dry stillness as Adam stacked scrap lumber outside the barn, the sun sitting sharp in the sky, bright enough to sting the eyes, while a thin haze softened the distance. Warm earth released its scent as boards shifted under his hands. His focus steady, familiar, the kind of work that asked for effort but not conversation. Nayeli stood near the cabin wall, her back against the logs, fingers curled around the leather cord that held her mother's ring. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to truly take in the ranch. The buildings were worn but functional, arranged for purpose rather than comfort. A place shaped by necessity instead of pride. It wasn't beautiful, but it felt honest. She catalogued every sound without thinking. The creak of the barn door, the slow breath of the horse inside, the scrape of Adam's boots against dirt. Her instincts had not relaxed, but the constant pressure at the base of her neck had loosened slightly. She moved toward the well and drew fresh water, the rope biting into her palms as the bucket rose. The cold shocked her when she dipped her hands, pulling a sharp breath from her chest. It steadied her. Adam noticed from across the yard, but didn't approach right away. He watched the way she adjusted her footing, how she lowered her shoulders after drinking, how her eyes swept the tree line before she turned her back on anything. He recognized that vigilance. When he finally walked over, he carried a cloth and a small tin of salve, holding them out without stepping too close. He told her quietly about the split on her knuckle, and she glanced down, surprised she'd missed it. After a moment's hesitation, she extended her hand just far enough for him to tend it. His touch was brief and careful, never lingering, and when he stepped back, she felt a thin thread of relief she hadn't expected. She thanked him softly, the word measured. He nodded and returned to his work. Later she sat on the porch step, rolling the ring cord between her fingers until she spoke without looking at him, telling him it had been her mother's, and that it was the one thing no one had ever managed to take. He didn't interrupt. He listened. She spoke of a man in the camp who demanded loyalty as if it were owed, who mistook feeding someone for ownership, and how laughter had been her only shield before she left. Adam crouched nearby, saying nothing, letting her words settle. When she finished, he told her simply that she wouldn't lose the ring here. She didn't answer, but something in her posture shifted. They worked together on a weak fence rail, their movements aligning without instruction, and she noticed how he checked her grip before tightening wire, making sure she wasn't straining. When she asked why he stayed alone on land so far from town, he answered without drama, that it was easier than dealing with people who brought their trouble with them, and admitted he had lost a brother. That town hadn't felt right afterward. She understood that kind of quiet grief. As evening approached, a rider appeared over the southern rise, pushing his horse hard. Nayeli froze, every muscle tightening as the man slowed near the yard, his gaze sharp with intent. When he asked if Adam had seen an Apache woman pass through, Adam answered evenly that no one had come through except him. The rider's eyes lingered on Nayeli with a look that spoke of ownership rather than curiosity, and Adam stepped forward just enough to make it clear the man would address him, not her. The warning that followed was met with calm refusal, and when the rider finally turned away, dust trailing behind him, Nayeli released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She told Adam the man knew the camp she'd fled, that men like him didn't stop easily. Adam answered that he wasn't handing anyone over because someone spoke loudly, and when she worried about dragging him into trouble, he told her that wasn't her burden. They returned to their work, the tension lingering but no longer suffocating, replaced by something quieter and more solid. The next morning brought a cooler, wind and the scent of sage as Adam sorted worn gear by the fence. Nayeli joined him without being asked, repairing leather straps with practiced skill, explaining that travel taught you to fix things or lose them. They spoke of the rider again, of the possibility he might return, and Adam made it clear that the issue wasn't her presence, but anyone who thought they could make demands on his land. As storm season crept closer, he told her she didn't need to rush anywhere, and she admitted she didn't want to stay, unless she was helping, rather than being tolerated. Adam answered simply that work went easier with another set of hands. They spent the afternoon repairing harnesses and checking beams, falling into a rhythm neither had expected, until the sky darkened with fast-moving, Clouds and the scent of rain thickened the air. As wind rose and drizzle began, they secured the barn doors together and retreated to the cabin as rain drummed harder against the roof. Inside, Adam rebuilt the fire while Nayeli sat near the wall, knees drawn in, memories flickering in the firelight. He told her she was safe, and not softly but with certainty. And when she admitted safety felt strange, he said, "You get used to it." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, warmth and steady presence eased something she had carried for too long. She slept at last, her hand relaxing around the ring for the first time since he'd found it. While Adam stayed awake, tending the fire and listening to the wind, aware that the cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one person alone. Morning came quietly after the storm, gentler than Nayeli expected. The rain had passed some time before dawn, leaving the air clean and cool. The earth darkened and steaming faintly as light filtered through the cabin window. She woke slowly, listening first, the habit ingrained too deeply to ignore. No shouting, no hoofbeats, no sudden movement, only the soft crackle of dying embers and the steady presence of Adam nearby. He sat in a chair pulled close to the wall, elbows resting on his knees, eyes lowered as if he had spent the night thinking rather than sleeping. When she shifted, he looked up and gave a small nod that carried no questions. He opened the door and let fresh air roll in, the smell of wet soil sharp and grounding. Outside, the ranch looked rinsed clean, fence posts dark with moisture, puddles gathered near the trough, the barn streaked with rain. Adam walked the south fence and tested the posts with his weight, noting where the ground had softened too much. Nayeli knelt beside him, pressing her fingers into the soaked earth and warning that if it dried unevenly, the rails would drop. He accepted her assessment without argument. They gathered tools and worked side by side, resetting posts and tightening wire before the sun climbed high, enough to harden the soil the wrong way. There was no need for instructions. Their movements fell into step, quiet and efficient, a rhythm that felt earned rather than assumed. At one point she paused and admitted she had planned to leave after the storm. Adam didn't react, only told her most travelers moved on when weather cleared. When she said she wasn't sure anymore, that danger followed her and she didn't want it at his door. He answered that trouble didn't frighten him, and that fear wasn't the one who should decide her path. She stood still for a long moment, staring at the trail beyond the ridge, and realized it no longer felt like an escape. When she told him she might stay longer if he didn't mind, he handed her a post driver and asked her to help set the rails before the ground dried wrong. The simplicity of his acceptance settled something deep in her chest. They worked until sweat dried on their skin and the fence stood straight again. Later, near the cabin, she untied the cord and slipped the ring onto her finger in the sunlight. The choice deliberate. Adam noticed but said nothing. The afternoon passed with small tasks, sorting tools, stacking logs, tightening latches until the ranch looked shaped by two sets of hands. As evening fell, she told him the ring once reminded her of where she came from, and now it reminded her of where she chose to stay. He placed his hand over hers, gentle and certain, and they carried water together under an orange sky, their steps matching without effort. The days that followed settled into a steady pattern. They rose early, worked through the heat, rested briefly at midday, and finished tasks before dusk. Nayeli learned the land the way Adam knew it, noticing where water pooled after rain and where the ground cracked first under drought. Adam learned her habits too, how she scanned the horizon without appearing to, how she measured trust in small increments, how she worked harder when given space rather than orders. One afternoon, fresh tracks appeared near the south fence. Adam crouched to study them, his expression unreadable. Nayeli felt the old tension rise but stayed still, waiting. The tracks were shallow, a single rider passing without stopping. Adam erased them with his boot and said nothing. That night, coyotes cried closer than usual. Nayeli woke and found Adam already awake, listening. He didn't speak reassurance this time. He didn't need to. His presence did the work. Another day brought a distant dust plume on the ridge road, gone as quickly as it appeared. Adam adjusted his routine, checking gates twice moving with the calm precision of someone who prepared rather than panicked. Naeli matched him, steady and alert, neither feeding the other's worry. When the patched rider returned days later, he did not come alone. Two men waited on the ridge while he rode closer, stopping well short of the yard. He called out again, voice louder, demanding. Adam stood firm, hands loose at his sides, and told him once more to move on. The man threatened consequences. Adam answered that any man who crossed his fence would answer for it. The standoff ended without violence, the riders retreating as the sun dipped low, but the tension lingered like heat after lightning. That night, Naeli told Adam she would leave at first light if it meant keeping his land safe. He listened, then said quietly that his land was safe because he kept it that way, not because he turned people away. She slept poorly, torn between gratitude and the old instinct to disappear before damage followed. Morning found her packing the few things she owned. Adam noticed and said nothing, finishing his chores as usual. When she finally stopped and admitted she didn't want to go, that staying felt like choosing something rather than running. He told her that choosing was the hardest part and the only one that mattered. She stayed. Days turned into weeks. The riders did not return. Work continued. Trust grew, not in grand gestures, but in shared effort and unspoken understanding. One evening, as they repaired the barn latch, their hands brushed and neither pulled away. The work finished, but something else had begun, clear and intentional. The ranch no longer felt like a refuge borrowed. It felt like a place being built. When the sun fell behind the ridge, Adam sat on the porch and Naeli leaned into the space beside him, her weight light but certain. For the first time in years, Adam didn't feel alone on his land. And for the first time since she fled her past, Naeli felt rooted enough to imagine a future that didn't require running. The change came quietly, the way lasting things often do. There was no single morning where the land looked different, no sudden declaration that marked the shift. Instead, it unfolded through ordinary days stitched together by shared purpose. Adam and Naeli moved through the ranch as if it had always belonged to both of them, their routines overlapping naturally. She rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare coffee while he checked the outer fence, and by the time the sun crested the ridge, they were already working side by side. Word traveled slowly in places like Red Valley, carried by riders who noticed repaired fences and livestock that no longer wandered. A ranch with two people watching it was a harder place to test. The men who had come looking for her did not return. Trouble, when denied oxygen, often moved on in search of easier ground. One afternoon, while mending a saddle girth, Naeli told Adam more about her mother, how she had taught her to read weather by the smell of the wind and judge men by how they treated animals rather than how loudly they spoke. Adam listened, fingers steady on the leather. When he admitted that his brother had once planned to expand the ranch, dreaming of a bigger spread and a family to fill it, the words surprised him as much as they did her. He had not spoken those thoughts aloud in years. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was reflective, a pause that allowed grief to exist without control over them. As summer leaned toward its end, the land grew harsher. Water became more precious, and Adam adjusted grazing patterns while Naeli reinforced the troughs and dug a shallow runoff, channeled to catch rare rainfall. Their cooperation had grown seamless, built on trust rather than need. One evening, after finishing a long day of work, Adam handed Naeli a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was the ring, newly set with a narrow band he had fashioned from salvaged silver, reinforcing the worn metal without erasing its history. He told her it deserved to last as long as the promise it carried. She didn't laugh this time. She slid it onto her finger and met his eyes, understanding fully what was being offered and what was not being demanded. The proposal, if it could be called that, came later and without ceremony. They sat on the porch watching the sky burn red and gold as the sun dipped low. Adam spoke of partnership, of building something that could outlast hardship, of choosing each other without obligation or fear. Naeli answered by taking his hand and saying she had already chosen. There was no rush, no need to mark the moment with witnesses or celebration. Their commitment was evident in every fence, line they reinforced, and every night they spent under the same roof by mutual choice. When autumn arrived, the ranch stood stronger than it had in years. Neighbors, few as they were, noticed the change in Adam Mercer. He no longer rode with the weight of isolation in his shoulders. And when Nayeli stood beside him, there was a quiet authority in her presence that discouraged questions. Together they faced the land as equals. The past did not disappear, but it lost its power to dictate the future. On the morning they finally rode into town together, it was not to announce anything, but to trade and resupply like any other ranching family. No one challenged them. No one needed to. The truth of their bond was visible in how they moved, how they watched each other's backs without looking. By the time they returned to the ranch, dust settling behind them in the late light, the land felt settled too, as if it recognized its keepers. That night, as stars filled the sky and coyotes cried in the distance, Nayeli rested her head against Adam's shoulder on the porch. The ring caught the firelight, no longer a symbol of what she had lost, but of what she had claimed. Adam looked out over the darkened fields and felt the weight he had carried for years finally ease. The ranch was no longer a place of retreat. It was a home, and the promise spoken in jest had become something stronger than any vow, life chosen, built, and defended together on land that now held both their names in its silence.